Not here. The white north has thy bones, and thou, heroic sailor soul, art passing on thine happier voyage now, toward no earthly pole. Alfred Tennyson. The remaining men of the Franklin expedition had deserted the icebreakers, the ships Erebus and Terror, in April of 1848, 105 souls strong. The ships had not moved in 2 years, sinking farther each night into the sea. Most of them were young enough that even after a year and more stuck fast in the ice floe, they saw no way that they could possibly die. Death, that was something that came for old men or soldiers in war, dirty fingers clenched around flintlock muskets. It came for poor, birthing mothers that howled their tearing grief to the night sky, and the children they bore who never breathed. It didn't come for young men, strong men who had withstood the winter on the decks of the icebreakers, bored but alive. Men who had cocked sidearms and hunted polar bears, who sang shanties and waited for the ice to thaw. They certainly didn't see death, a black and tattered omen, waiting for them on the bow of those ships as they left to find civilization. The sailors were cocksure, animated, and positive that they would continue their lives once they reached a manned outpost, or even an Inuit village. So, with futures fresh in their minds, they didn't pack for the trips like men on the verge of perishing. What they should have taken were packs full of food, weaponry, and as much warm clothing as they could possibly carry. Things to make a fire, medicine. All of those things were brought, of course. They were young but not completely foolish. But they also took with them the things they believed they would need to continue their lives back home. Maybe hailed as heroes, even if the Franklin expedition didn't find the Northwest Passage. Things that would ascertain their wealth once they were home. Things to start a household, a family. Books, silverware, trinkets, and even furniture. The men abandoning the Erebus and the Terror packed for a trip home, pulling all of their useless things in sledges made from lifeboats. There was an air of hope about them, even after losing Captain Franklin. But the North was not kind to them. Life, away from the ships and on the pack ice, became cruel. William Ellis had forgotten a lot of things during that time, but the most striking of those things was color. The horizon was ice, white and bitter blue. The sky, gray. There had been hints of other hues, bile green of vomit, the mottled red and mushroom gray of his skin, and the bright, offensive scarlet of blood in the snow. That was all. Nothing more. They had walked for weeks, making camp every night and breaking it in the morning. At first, the pace had been swift and steady, but the men slowly stumbled, the entire procession of them getting more weak and tired by the day. It was 2 nights at one camp, and then 5 at the next. The unbearable weight of packing up camp and continuing became insurmountable. So instead of moving forward towards a settlement they weren't even sure still existed, they ate their tin can rations and slept. And on the rare days everyone felt at least somewhat alive, they moved, ever slowly, towards Bax River and hopefully civilization. But maybe, the expedition had simply been cursed from the start. Time was slippery, the cycles of day and night nonsensical to William, the longer they were out there on the ice. When he slept, he dreamt of the ships, the groaning of their wooden bodies slowly crushing inward. Those dreams were so vivid that he often questioned whether he really was back on the Erebus, and the trek across the ice was the true dream. But no. The frozen tips of his fingers as he tore down his tent made him certain that it was the never-ending walk that was the reality, not the ship. They were both hellish, anyway. It became a sort of monotony, and there was comfort in that fact. William felt like a creature driven across an empty expanse of land with a pack of his kind, sure that somewhere on the outskirts of the group there was a shepherd guiding them. Surely they weren't just walking in a rough direction, depending only on a compass needle. Captain Crozier wouldn't do that to them. Would he? When a man would die during the night, they would leave him where he lay. The energy to extricate him from his tent and conduct some sort of burial was impossible to muster. The tragedy of it made him grieve, just like everyone else, but beneath it there was a panic growing in William's heart. "Please, God," he would pray in the shivering darkness. "Please, don't let me spend eternity here, in the cold." He pulled his tattered, worn naval coat around his body and walked. There was nothing else to be done. It was because of time slipping through his fingers that William didn't realize that his group was growing exponentially smaller, night by night. It was not the slow die-off of a few sick crewmates during the night, but the simple disappearance of dozens and dozens of men between one breath and another. It had to be. Otherwise, he would have noticed them leaving, noticed them dying. But what did it matter? William Ellis was a beast of burden being guided through the mountain pass. A lamb trotted through the snow to the slaughter. They dwindled over 100 to 50, 30 to 15. And then one morning William awoke and there were only 3. Himself, Ice Master William Ellis, Amos Hawthorne, a bosun, and young Thomas Penny, a deckhand. That wasn't to say the rest of the men were dead, just lost. William's group was separated somehow, and when they decided to try to catch back up with the group, the storm came. The horizon was already so plain and unchanging that it had been hard to navigate, but when the storm hit them, it was a whiteout so intense that it was impossible for them to see or attempt to track the rest of the Franklin expedition party. Had they been less tired and downtrodden, the fear might have been a little more intense, but for the 3, it felt more like inevitability. Fate, even. They had stepped into the regal, spectacular icebreakers years before, always destined to be lost on the ice, nearly alone. They saw life sometimes, but it was almost always the hulking, lumbering silhouettes of the polar bears in the distance. The dark meat of their flesh, and the toxic iron-full livers that had sickened more than a few of the crew, made them more trouble than it was worth to hunt. That wasn't even mentioning the claws and teeth. 3 men were rarely a match for the creatures. Amidst the relentless Arctic storm, William Ellis, Amos Hawthorne, and Thomas Penny trudged onward, their bodies battered by the biting winds and their spirits weighed down by the frigid despair. Every step was a struggle, the snowdrifts reaching up to snatch at their boots, while the howling wind whipped through the barren landscape, an unseen predator twisting around those more tangible. As they fought against the tempest, it was pointless for the three men to try and communicate. Any yelling was carried away by the roaring gusts and the blinding snow. There was something off about the wind howling in his ears, though. Sounds more complex, more disjointed than they should be. He couldn't concentrate too hard on them, though, or else the truth of it started to creep in. William didn't have much left, and he wasn't about to surrender his sanity so easily. He couldn't shake it, though. It was like voices. Voices in the wind. Voices that he had heard before, booming from one end of the Erebus to the other, or talking softly in the below decks during dinner time. Squinting through the blinding snow, his breath ragged and his face flushed with cold, he looked for the forms of Amos and Thomas. Dread knotted in his stomach, intertwining with misery. "Lads!" William called. "Are you near?"
"Aye!"
Amos shouted.
"Here, sir!"
Thomas added. Good. So they weren't lost. At least not yet. Cupping his gloved hands to his mouth, William yelled, "Come to me!" Slowly, two forms emerged from the white to appear next to him, only their faces visible in the pile of heavy clothes that both of them wore. There was a breath of relief now that he wasn't alone, but William also felt a sinking feeling now that he could see them. Because there were still windy voices ghosting around them. "Have you boys been talking to one another?" he asked, knowing what the answer was going to be. "No, too damn loud out here," Amos confirmed, a shadow passing over his expression. "Are you asking because you both hear it too?" Thomas added, looking between Amos and William. The people. The chill William felt was internal, different from the cold racking his physical body. "Has to be a trick of the wind. We should probably make camp and hope this all passes." Amos squinted at the solid gray sky, looking for some sign of where the sun was. After a second, he shook his head. "I think we need to keep pushing forward. If we camp too early, we're going to lose track of night and day." Thomas, his weary mind clouded by exhaustion and fear, sighed. "God help us." William set his jaw and stared in the distance, knowing there was nothing for his eyes to meet. "Forward, then, and we will see what fate has set to meet us." The storm raged with an unrelenting fury, biting through the thickest of their coats and chilling their very bones. The three men, weathered and worn survivors, stumbled forward, their faces obscured by icy beards and expressions etched with desperation. All the while, the voices whispered in the wind. William caught snippets of conversations he had heard play out between crewmates, then words that had spoken directly to him, and worst of all, pleas for salvation. "It's just one winter.
Captain Franklin is it?
Ice won't
Captain
soon
Crozier
enough.
won't leave the Terror. What do we
Sometimes
do?
I think the boys we buried back on
Please,
the
William,
island
please.
were the lucky ones.
I know you hear me. Please don't leave me behind in this God-forsaken place."
He tried not to hear them. He really did. But they were speaking to William Ellis, and he had no control over it. As they pressed on, hope waning with every gust of icy wind, a faint glow pierced through the veil of snowflakes. Its feeble yellow light beckoned them forth, casting an anemic glow that clashed with the surrounding desolation. An outpost, singular and isolated, stood stood defiantly against the storm's wrath. It should have been impossible.
Look!
Amos shouted above the howling tempest, his voice barely carrying beyond his companions.
A cabin! We must take shelter!
His words hung in the air, wrestling against the doubts that gnawed at their hearts. The mere presence of the cabin, a solitary outpost in this forsaken wilderness, defied all logic. How could it exist here, where no signs of civilization had been seen for miles? William had studied the maps by the light of kerosene lantern during the early days of the trek. They had a long way to go before they reached Back's Fish River and the settlement there within. According to the map, there was certainly no outpost between where the icebreakers had been beset for the last 2 years and the river. Amos had to know the same, but he was apparently plenty cold enough to ignore that fact and take the apparent blessing for what it was. But as cold as William was, something about the distant structure set his nerves on edge.
Amos, I'm not so sure.
His friend didn't take his hesitation well.
Well, the damned lights are on. It's occupied, and we're freezing to death. How is this even a question? Don't you feel it?
William looked first at Amos and then Thomas.
Something is off.
Thomas was looking at the ground, but he spoke loud enough to be heard.
Sir, I can't feel much of anything. Not anymore. I say we take the chance.
Maybe he was just being a fool. William closed his eyes, but when he did so, the voices in the wind grew louder.
Captain Franklin is dead. They're saying the expedition is cursed.
Bears are circling the ships at night. I think they smell the dead.
The storm, relentless and unforgiving, pushed them closer to the precipice of their decision. Their bodies ached, weary from the harsh journey, while their spirits craved respite from the elements. Yet an unshakable unease tinged the air, a primal instinctual warning.
Fine, he relented. If it will get me out of this damned wind, then yes, we can take shelter.
When the other two continued on, William hung back, pulling out his flintlock pistol and checking that it was still functional. That and a short sword at his hip were all he had, and he had never drawn the sword.
I've had many firsts these last 2 years,
he thought.
This is one I would like to avoid.
The 3 men approached the outpost cautiously, their weary steps crunching through the deep snowfall. The sense of foreboding grew stronger with every passing moment, tendrils of unease creeping up their spines and wrapping around them like wires. A cabin loomed before them, an impossible thing in frozen wasteland, its weathered timbers breaking in the relentless wind. As they neared the door, their breaths, visible puffs of white in the frigid air, they found it locked, a solid barrier barring their entry. Frustration mingled with their trepidation, the possibility of shelter slipping through their frostbitten fingers. Yet, the allure of warmth and safety was too powerful to abandon. William paused, looking back at Amos and Thomas's expectant faces, and was compelled to do something very strange. He lifted his gloved hand and rapped his knuckles against the wood, a hollow sound that seemed to be swallowed by the whispering, speaking wind. The moment that he knocked, William knew, down to his very soul, that it was a mistake to do so. He also knew, with the same grim certainty, that someone was going to answer. They waited, their breath held in anticipation, until finally a shuffling of footsteps sounded from within. The door swung open, revealing a figure silhouetted in the firelight that froze the blood in their veins. With golden curls falling around his shoulders, John Torrington stood in front of them. John observed them quietly, his features gaunt and pale, his eyes clouded with an otherworldly light. His clothing was tattered, marked by the harsh conditions that should have claimed his life long ago. Time froze, and William was transported back 2 years to Beachy Island in the crackling of a young man's lungs inside the surgeon's tent. John Torrington, more boy than man, his lips cyanotic, his breathing agonal. Each of the crew went into that tent, humid with disease and the smell of disinfectant, and had told John their goodbyes. He was terrified, and none of them had the heart to actually say farewell to him, but they visited nonetheless. John had known why, and by the end he begged the surgeon not to let any more sailors come in to see him. He asked to continue the visits the next day, but the surgeon had just frowned and let the next man inside to see John. A silent admission that there would be no tomorrows for him. They had been dumbstruck at losing someone so early in the expedition, and Torrington was followed by 3 other deaths before they left that damned island. It had taken days, not hours, to dig a measly 4 feet down into the permafrost to bury the bodies. After the first grave, they thought to just store the bodies upon the ship under the ice until the rats began to eat the dead. So they stayed even longer, digging the most difficult graves ever dug and laying to rest their friends. These memories were some of the clearest to William, building the caskets, refilling the grave with the damp soil and ice, and praying for the boy's salvation. William Ellis had touched John Torrington's fevered skin as he lay dying of pneumonia, and the next day he had felt the waxy chill of his cold flesh when he said his final goodbye. He remembered the fog of his eyes and the way his mouth was slack, worm-gray tongue and gums, making William's stomach churn. He knew, in his heart, in the very marrow of his bones, that John Torrington was dead.
John?
William stammered, disbelief etched across his face.
But we buried you on Beachy Island. How?
John Torrington's voice, thin and raspy, cut through the freezing air.
I never died,
he said, a ghost of a smile flickering on his lips.
I've been here, in this outpost, for the past 2 years.
Shock paralyzed William, and the few bites of hard tack he had allowed himself earlier in the day threatened to crawl up his throat. There was no way, no damned way that John Torrington was there, alive. Yet he was. William felt Amos's hand on his shoulder, gripping with furious strength.
Don't,
the boatswain hissed.
William, don't.
John beckoned them inside, his eyes filled with a peculiar mix of relief and anguish.
I have so much to tell you,
he said, his voice carrying a weight of unspeakable sorrow.
But first, come in, find warmth. You've been through hell, my friends.
It was Thomas that moved first, past Amos and William and into the warmth of the cabin. He looked back at the other 2, and it struck William at that moment how achingly young he was. Torrington had been young too, when they buried him, only 19. Trembling, William shrugged off Amos's hand and followed Thomas inside. The siren call of the warm, bright outpost cabin too much to resist. Doubt swirled within him, the dissonance between his memories and the reality before him threatening to shatter his fragile sanity. Yet there was a glimmer of hope in John's oddly cloudy eyes, and it compelled him forward. He heard a faint curse at his back, and then a shuffle of boots as Amos followed.
My friends, my dear friends,
John said, over and over as he moved about the small space. His navy uniform coat seemed to hang on his frame, the blue dye of it still bright, but the edges frayed.
It does my heart so good to see you. I thought myself lost forever.
William heard the faint click of the door being closed and turned his head to see Amos, so stiff he might have been electrified, still hovering near the entrance. The flickering light of a dying fire danced across the room, casting long, unsettling shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The air was thick with an earthy scent, mingling damp wood and musty fabric, hinting at the passage of time and neglect. Its single room was compact, its dimensions emphasizing the confinement of their supposed sanctuary. And the ceiling, low and lined with crude wooden beams, gave the space an oppressive closeness. To one side stood a rickety wooden table, its surface marred by the scars of countless meals. A solitary oil lamp perched upon its worn surface, casting a dim glow that barely penetrated the surrounding gloom. The feeble light revealed a scattering of maps, their edges curled with age, and scraps of tattered paper. Pages torn from a book, maybe. Against one wall, a thin cot sagged under threadbare blankets, their colors faded all to a muted brown. Beside it, a small bookshelf stood, its shelves filled with weathered tomes, spines cracked and yellowed. In one corner, a rusted pot dangled above a cold hearth, its blackened walls coated with soot. The cook fire had nearly burned out, leaving only a hollow, lifeless hearthstone. But it was the atmosphere itself that unsettled William the most. The air felt heavy, as if it contained the weight of untold tales and long-forgotten nightmares, pressing against their weary bodies and clouding their thoughts. Through the minuscule spaces in the logs, snippets of the wind whispers bled through, only single words now that they had the cabin walls for protection. Contaminated.
Murder.
Sorry. Oh, ignore the wind, John told them, adding a log to the hearth fire. Something about the way it bends through the cabin makes it seem so strange. Don't you agree? As they settled in, seeking refuge from the storm's relentless assault, a sense of disquiet descended upon them. William couldn't escape the nagging feeling that they were the intruders in a realm that wasn't quite the same one they existed in back on the Erebus in Terror. We leave in the morning, Amos declared. John turned to the boatswain. All four of us? Amos's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Come, Amos, Thomas encouraged him from where he sat on the floor in front of the hearth. It's much warmer. William had moved without even realizing it, and he was inches from young Thomas by that time, shooting John an unsure look, but noting that the man had busied himself with something near the bookcase. William relented to the call of the small fire and sat there next to Thomas. Finally, John lowered himself into one of the chairs at the wooden table, giving Amos enough space that he felt secure enough to to join William and Thomas. He never took his eyes off the supposedly dead man, keeping himself turned towards him at all times.
"Aren't you cold over there?"
Thomas asked John, still so unbothered by everything that it boggled William's mind. John simply shrugged. Rarely. Always. And so, huddled together in the flickering glow of a struggling fire, the survivors of the Franklin expedition listened. Their hearts were heavy with longing and trepidation as John Torrington began to recount the unfathomable tale of his survival. The flickering fire cast eerie shapes across the worn faces of the three, their eyes locked onto John Torrington as he spoke in hushed tones, the cabin's walls seemingly absorbing his words. "I know it's hard to believe," John began, "but you must understand. The memory of my death is a distortion. I was merely separated from the crew at Beachy Island, hopelessly lost to all of you. I walked day and night until I stumbled upon this outpost." The men exchanged perplexed glances, their minds struggling to reconcile the impossible. They knew, deep within their souls, that Beachy Island lay hundreds of miles beyond them. William clung to distant memories of a frozen grave, of bandaged hands from hours and days of digging. Yet the exhaustion and fear that clung to him like a second skin threatened to unravel his skepticism. "But, John," William said, his voice trembling, "we buried you. We held a funeral. How can you be here?" John's eyes were mired with sorrow or madness. "It was a mistake," he insisted, his voice growing faint. "A misunderstanding, a collective delusion born out of despair. I am here now, with you, my friends. Please believe me." Their bodies sagged, the weight of their weariness dragging them deeper into the murky depths of uncertainty. They had fought against the storm, battled against the icy grip of death, and now they stood on the precipice of accepting a truth that defied all reason. The allure of warmth and the relief of finding their lost comrade clouded their judgment. With a resigned nod, Amos spoke, his voice tinged with defeat. Perhaps you're right, John. We've seen such horrors, endured unthinkable hardships. Our minds are fragile, shattered pieces of what they once were. If you say you never died, then who are we to question it? John's features softened, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for accepting me, despite the inconceivable. We shall face whatever awaits us together." They huddled closer, their bodies seeking solace in the company of one another. The storm raged on outside, its howls seeping through the cracks in the cabin's walls. But within the confines of that enigmatic outpost, a different tempest brewed. A storm of doubt, fear, and the unfathomable secrets that hung heavy in the air. John rose from his seat. "You must be starving. What rations have you?" "Just canned food and hardtack." William pulled his discarded pack to him and started to pull out the silver cans with their faded labels. Beef and vegetables, mostly. The taste is odd and the color has gone off inside one of them, but they fill the belly well enough." John collected the cans from the floor. "Rest," I will prepare some food. Tomorrow we will discuss what to do next, but for now, just rest." With his weight leaning heavily on Amos, William dozed, drifting between wakefulness and a restless sleep. He could hear John opening the cans, and the liquid slosh of a few of them being poured into a charred cookpot. The smell made his stomach rumble, but there was a note of foulness to it. Still, William did not care. Foul or not, he was starving, and would eat whatever he was served. John hung the cookpot over the hearth fire and added more wood to the flames, stoking it until the warmth and glow of it was the closest thing to heaven William had ever experienced. The 3 survivors awoke, shrugged off their packs, coats, hats, and even gloves, feeling blood returning to numb extremities. Their long-lost crewmate served them a rough, saltless stew, poured right back into the tin cans that had been opened. It was full of beans, potatoes, and a soft, white meat that William hadn't found in any of the canned food before. It was the most glorious thing he had ever tasted.
"I could have sworn all we had was beef," he commented between bites, passing the burning hot can from hand to hand.
"It's just some meat I had left over from a hunt," John assured him.
"The cold does wonders for preservation, if nothing else."
With a stomach full of hot food, and feeling more human than he had since they started their doomed march, sleep was pulling at William yet again, so hard that he could not resist. Thomas was already asleep, his overcoat folded beneath his head like a pillow. Amos was fighting it, but William saw that he too was on the verge of collapse and slumber. The boatswain jumped when John laid one of the tattered blankets over his shoulders, and then did the same for William. The rough fabric smelled like rot and mildew, but it was a blanket nonetheless. So, taking notes from young Thomas, William folded his coat as well and laid down, pretending not to see the blackened tips of his fingers when he pillowed his hands beneath his head. He slept, the hard wooden floor rivaling the most blissful goose down mattress from back home. William did not know when John joined them on the floor, the crackling of the fire drowned out by the movements of the resurrected man and the whispers of the wind through the cracks in their temporary home. But the fire died down through the night, even if the storm didn't. And sometimes, those words on the air filtered through his dreams. William didn't dream of his ship, or the ice, that night. He dreamt of the friction of the rope burning through his best leather gloves when they lowered a casket into the ground, and of John Torrington's fretful, ever-weakening sobs through the canvas tent as he cried for his mother through the hours of his death. William dreamt of the way John's lungs had crackled like kindling, and then at the end, rattled like mooring chains. He awoke at some unknown hour, when the cabin was nearly pitch black, and saw a silhouette of one of his companions knelt over another. It was Amos, given away by his broad shoulders, thumbing a weathered rosary while leaning over John Torrington. William heard the words dripping from Amos's mouth, and they sent goosebumps rising all over his air-chapped skin.
"Lord our God, be merciful to us, your image, and save your servant John Torrington from every threat or harm from the evil one, and protect by raising him above all evil. We ask you this through the intercession of our most blessed, glorious Lady, Mary ever Virgin, Mother of God, of the most splendid archangels."
Amos was whispering, quick and desperate. John was curled on his side, facing William, his breaths even and slow in sleep. even as Amos prayed over him. But when William's eyes dragged down to John's face, he found his eyes wide open, the whites showing on all sides, milky still, but alert. Fear gripped William's heart like a vice, and he tried to speak, to warn Amos, but sleep was pulling him under again like an inescapable tide. He couldn't look away from John, couldn't cut eye contact. And then, even though John's mouth remained closed, William heard him speak right before he passed out into restless sleep once more. "They are like raging waves of the sea," John said without moving his lips, "foaming out their own shame, wandering stars, to whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever." William's sleep, the sleep that was seemingly forced upon him, offered no true rest. Instead, it was simply more visions. The sounds of tent canvas flapping, images of pulling off his gloves and his hands being nothing more than blue-black shriveled claws. A shadow that flickered in and out of sight on top of Amos in the howling snowfall, peeling the skin of his face off to reveal the white of his skull and the black hollows of his eye sockets. And then, over and over, in a loop, the shutting of John Torrington's casket and the painful process of lowering him down. Through the night, in his mind, William laid the boy to rest dozens of times. And when he woke up, John was laying more wood on the hearth fire, hundreds of miles away and 4 feet above where William had last seen him. John turned to William, his eyes hollow, their once vibrant light now dimmed. William recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. "Amos took the musket and went to hunt," John informed him. William could count his vertebrae through his thin white cotton shirt. "He will be back soon, I suppose." "Hunt what?" He forced himself to rise to a sitting position, feeling even more tired than he had the night before. "I don't know. He swore he heard a bear outside before the sun rose." William looked over at Thomas, still sleeping. John's words made him very, very uncomfortable. "Amos is one man against a polar bear. Certainly you can see the folly in such an errand." The younger man that William had buried brought him another tin of stew, which William ate, despite the worry gnawing at him. John didn't speak for some time, but when he finally answered, there was despair in his voice. "We all choose our own fates, don't we?" There was more of the soft, white meat in the stew that morning, and it had the faint taste of pork. William didn't question it, even when he knew that the bear meat was quite dark. Maybe it had been a young bear. He finished the tin, standing and stretching his arms over his head. Perhaps he did feel somewhat better than he had the night before. At least the food would sustain him, even if his sleep was uncomfortable and, at times, frightening. The image of Amos praying over John filtered through his mind's eye, and he shuddered. "I'm going to find Amos. Don't wake Thomas. I think this trek has been the hardest on him." "Truly." "I think I may offer some competition in that aspect. Don't you?" William paled, his arms halfway in his coat. "John, No worries, my friend." William watched John move out of the corner of his eye, not looking directly at him, and the other man seemed to flicker. A trick of the light, maybe, It isn't as if I was buried alive by a group of men ignorant enough to believe me dead, or that I had to claw my way out of a wooden casket, and then out of the earth itself. That would be ridiculous. William said nothing. The wind bled through the cracks of the cabin.
Only 19.
A shame. But it is good that I survived, of course, John continued, pacing a circle around William, but somehow never fully in his sight. My dear mother would have never been able to rest knowing her only boy was buried in the Arctic, never to return. It would have driven her mad. Perhaps she would have dreamt of me waking up in the freezing ground in a casket, scratching at the boards until my nails tore from my fingers and the flesh wore down to the bone.
Don't. William, don't.
He stumbled back a few steps. John was suddenly in front of him, his hands grasping William's shoulders to steady him. Between one blink and another, he was sure the man's face was pulled in the rictus grin of a skull. Easy, easy. Sit, William. Your face has gone white. The other two will be back soon, I'm sure, with fresh meat. His eyes shot over to the battered floorboards where young Thomas had just been sleeping. Where are they, John? He demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. Where are Thomas and Amos? John's voice wavered, a frail attempt at reassurance. They went hunting, he replied again, his tone strained. I tried to wake you, but you were deeply asleep. They didn't want to disturb you. William's heart raced, pounding against his chest as his skepticism deepened. His mind frantically searched for the truth, sensing the deception that seemed to cling to the very walls of the cabin. The improbability of their sudden departure without any sign or sound troubled him deeply. Thomas had been right there. No, William muttered, his voice trembling. No, John, that can't be true. We wouldn't leave without each other. He felt mania creeping in, a frantic feeling that drove at him like a whip. They wouldn't leave without me. Tell me where they really are. John's eyes flickered, a mixture of sorrow and desperation glimmering within. I promise, William. They went hunting. They'll be back soon. Please, believe me. I never wanted to deceive you. William shook his head, his doubt hardening into conviction. No, I can't trust you, he declared, his voice growing stronger. I should have believed Amos. You were supposed to be dead, buried on Beachy Island. I won't fall victim to your lies. John's visage fell, his shoulders slumping in resignation. I understand your skepticism, he murmured, his voice laced with sorrow. But I am not the enemy here. The truth will reveal itself in time, William. Please be patient. We are all in this together. As William stared into John's haunted eyes, a surge of defiance coursed through him. He wouldn't allow himself to be swayed by the apparition that stood before him. This impossibility that challenged his grip on reality. With resolve in his voice, he spoke, each word punctuated harshly. I will find the truth, William spat, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. Whether it lies within this cabin or out there on the ice, I will uncover it. And when I do, we shall see whose words ring true. With his declaration lingering in the air, William pushed past John, his heart fueled by a fierce determination. Nothing was right. John wavered between vaguely threatening to sorrowfully begging William to believe him, and Thomas, had all but disappeared right under his eyes. He was on the precipice of leaving, desperate to escape the cabin's unsettling grip, when John's voice cut through the tension-laden air. "Wait, William," John pleaded, his voice carrying an eerie weight. "Before you go, there is something we must discuss." Frozen in place with the door barely cracked, William turned to face John, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I believe we've said all that needs to be said, John." John's gaze bore into William's soul, his voice a haunting whisper. "Remember, William, the nights you spent out in the vast darkness, on the frozen ground. The things you did, the choices you made. They haunt you still, don't they?" William's legs weakened beneath him, and he sank back to lean against the cabin wall, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The weight of John's words pressed upon his mind, the fragments of memories flicking in the recesses of his consciousness. The thundering crack of his flintlock pistol, red blood on snow. Drawing his short sword, the jittering sawing of steel on bone. Could it be true? Had he truly committed unspeakable acts? "Stop!" William cried out, his voice a fragile thread. "You're playing with my mind. None of this can be real." Ghostly voices crept in through the barely opened door. It was his own this time. "We have to do it, Amos. He's weak. He's not going to make it anyway." A cruel smile flickered across John's face, a smile that held the weight of wicked knowledge. "Oh, but it is real, William. The cabin is but a veil that shields you from the unforgiving truth. Out there, on the edge of reason, the darkness consumes us." A shiver coursed through William's body as John's revelation settled within him. His mind grasped for fragments of truth, attempting to piece together a fractured reality. Could it be possible? Was he truly lost in a labyrinth of his own making? Poor Amos, most of all. Is it true that you drove the blade through his gut, but didn't even have the fortitude to finish it before he bled out? Shameful, my friend. So shameful. "Stop!" William pleaded, his voice a broken whisper. "Please, no more." But John continued, his voice relentless and unforgiving. In that moment, as the veil of the cabin's illusion wavered, William's grasp on reality slipped further away. The truth beckoned, elusive and enigmatic, waiting to reveal itself in the barren expanses beyond the confines of his crumbling mind. "You were always going to die, William." John Torrington's words were like the tolling of a church bell. The cans were tainted. Amos and Thomas, they ate from the cans, and you? Well, the taint is in you too, now. You were always going to die, William. But now you'll die a monster. In the wind, John was speaking too. Years passed in a humid surgeon's tent, mad with fever. "Send me home, please. Just send me home. I don't want to be buried out here on the ice. I want my mother." Amos's groans, the smell of roasting meat, the juice of it exploding across his tongue, burning his taste buds in ecstasy and agony. William put his hands on either side of his head and shook it, hard, until the wooden walls around him blinked in and out of reality. Walls, canvas, and then William closed his eyes, and all of the warmth, the sooty smell of the fire, the whipping of the wind were gone. He opened them, and it was all darkness, so heavy and black that it was almost tangible. He smelled the rotten scent of spoiled poultice, the ripe scent of unwashed skin, and the sickly sweet smell of the breath of the dying. William was on his back, and he slammed his hands upward, palms meeting a flat, wooden plank. Speckles of snow and permafrost drifted down from the gaps between the casket boards and landed, invisibly on his face. His fingernails caught in the splinters and ripped free as he clawed. William screamed.